The blue light flashed for the last time in 2024. No ceremony, no crowd, just a manager locking the door of the final full-size Kmart on the American mainland, and silence where a roar once lived. What roar? At its peak, Kmart was everywhere. 2,486 stores, 350,000 workers, 37 billion in revenue. The blue light special made housewives sprint down aisles. Attention Kmart shoppers, 3 words every American knew by heart. For 30 years, Kmart wasn't just a store. It was the place where working-class America bought its school clothes, its Christmas gifts, its everyday life. Then it was gone. Not killed by Walmart, not ambushed by Amazon. Kmart was dismantled from the inside by distracted executives, a fraudulent CEO, and a hedge fund billionaire who saw real estate where others saw people. How does a 125-year empire destroy itself? Detroit, Michigan, 1899 to 2024. This is the story of America's greatest retail self-destruction and the 350,000 people who never saw it coming. Sebastian Sparing Kreska was not born into money. He grew up in Bald Mount, Pennsylvania, the son of a farmer, working odd jobs before finding his calling as a traveling salesman. Hauling tinware across the country, knocking on doors, learning one fundamental truth about the American consumer. People always need things, and they always want to pay less for them. In 1897, Kresge crossed paths with Frank Woolworth, the man who had already built a fortune selling 5 and 10 cent merchandise through a chain of identical stores. The model was elegant in its simplicity. No negotiating, no haggling. Fixed low prices, high volume, consistent experience. Kresge didn't just admire it, he memorized it. He partnered with a friend named John McCrory, and together they opened 2 dime stores, one in Memphis, one in Detroit. 2 years later, the partnership dissolved. McCrory kept Memphis, Kresge kept Detroit. That decision would change American retail history. With an $8,000 investment and a single store on Detroit's busy downtown corridor, Sebastian Kresge opened SS Kresge Company in 1899. The shelves were stocked with costume jewelry, housewares, and personal grooming items. Nothing fancy, nothing aspirational. Just things people used every day, priced so that a factory worker's wife could walk in with $2 and walk out with her arms full. Kresge himself lived by the same philosophy he sold. He didn't drink, he didn't gamble. He wore plain suits and drove unremarkable cars long after he became a millionaire. He understood his customer because he had been his customer. That authenticity translated directly into trust, and trust translated into foot traffic. By 1912, your SS Kresge Company had incorporated in Delaware with 85 stores and 10.3 million on annual sales. By 1918, it was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. By 1940, there were 682 stores across America, and the company had survived the Great Depression. Not despite its low prices, but because of them. When people had almost nothing, Kresge gave them somewhere to stretch what little they had. The dime store era had a ceiling, though, and everyone in retail knew it. Suburban America was exploding after World War II. Highways were connecting cities to sprawling new neighborhoods. Families were buying cars, moving out of urban centers, and looking for a new kind of shopping experience, one that matched the scale of their new lives. The old downtown dime store model, however profitable, couldn't follow them there. Kresge's successor, a quiet but visionary executive named Harry Blair Cunningham, saw what was coming. In the late 1950s, Cunningham traveled across the country studying discount retail operations, a new experimental format where stores were massive, merchandise was diverse, and the entire business model was built around one promise: the lowest price in the room, every single day. He came back to Detroit with a blueprint. On January 25, 1962, the first Kmart store opened in Garden City, Michigan. It was nothing like a dime store. It was enormous, a cavernous space selling clothing, appliances, electronics, housewares, toys, and food all under one roof. The prices were aggressive. The selection was overwhelming. The parking lot was the size of a city block. People came in curious. They left converted. Kresge himself was 84 years old that year, Long retired, watching from a distance as the company he built with $8,000 and a handshake became something he could never have imagined. He died in 1966, 4 years after the first Kmart opened, and just early enough to miss the empire that his dime store philosophy had made possible. The machine was already running without him, and it was just getting started. The formula worked from day one. Kmart opened stores the way other companies opened envelopes: fast, efficient, and without hesitation. An average of 85 new locations every single year through the 1960s and 1970s. Small towns, suburbs, industrial corridors. Anywhere a parking lot could hold 100 cars and a family needed somewhere to shop, a Kmart appeared. By 1981, the 2000th Kmart store opened its doors. The number felt almost incomprehensible. 2,000 identical blue signs, 2,000 sets of automatic doors, 2,000 stores stretching from Maine to California. But raw scale alone doesn't explain what Kmart meant to America. To understand that, you have to understand the blue light special. It started in 1965 quietly at a single store in Garden City. A manager wanted to move excess inventory fast. Instead of marking down a shelf and hoping people noticed, he grabbed a portable police siren, the kind with a rotating blue light, rolled it to the middle of an aisle, switched it on, and picked up the intercom. "Attention Kmart shoppers, for the next 15 minutes only." The store went electric. Customers dropped what they were doing and moved toward the light. Word spread to the next aisle, then the next. People who had been heading for the exit turned around. The items sold out in minutes. Corporate heard about it, then rolled it out nationwide. What the blue light special created was something no advertising budget could buy: urgency, theater, and community. All at once. The light could flash at any moment. You never knew which aisle, which product, which price. So you stayed alert. You kept shopping. You lingered longer than you planned because leaving meant possibly missing something. Kmart had accidentally invented one of the most psychologically effective retail mechanisms in American history, and it cost nothing but a rotating siren and a microphone. By the late 1960s, "Attention Kmart shoppers" had become part of the American vernacular. It showed up in movies, in jokes, in the daily language of millions of households. Tim Burton referenced it in Beetlejuice. Comedians used it as shorthand for bargain basement deals. But for working-class families, the people Kmart was actually built for, it wasn't a punchline. It was a ritual, a sound that meant something good was about to happen, and you could afford it. Kmart understood something that many retailers still struggle with. Shopping is emotional. It isn't purely transactional. The smell of popcorn near the entrance, the lunch counter with its Salisbury steak and fountain drinks, the aisles wide enough for a stroller and a shopping cart side by side. These weren't accidents. They were the architecture of comfort. Kmart felt familiar before you'd ever been inside one, because every location felt exactly like the last. In 1977, the transformation was made official. S.S. Kresge Company, the name of a Pennsylvania tinware salesman who opened 2 dime stores in 1899, was retired. The company renamed itself Kmart Corporation, acknowledging what everyone already knew. The Kmart stores now accounted for 94.5% of the company's total domestic sales. The dime store era was history. The discount era had won. By 1990, Kmart was the second largest retailer in the United States, behind only Sears, ahead of Walmart, ahead of Target, ahead of everyone. The blue light was still flashing. Nobody noticed the darkness gathering at the edges. By the early 1990s, Kmart wasn't just a retailer, it was a cultural institution, and the people running it knew it. They moved with the confidence of a company that had never truly lost, only slowed down, recalibrated, and kept going. The headquarters in Troy, Michigan hummed with ambition. Executives talked about Kmart the way generals talk about an undefeated army. The map of America was almost entirely covered. The brand was universally recognized. The revenue was staggering. Then came 1987, in a decision that looked, at the time, like pure genius. Kmart signed a contract with Martha Stewart, then a rising lifestyle personality, not yet the household name she would become, to serve as the company's entertainment and lifestyle spokesperson. The partnership made strategic sense on paper. Kmart needed to elevate its image beyond bargain bin perception, and Stewart needed a massive retail platform to grow her brand. What neither side fully anticipated was how transformative the collaboration would become. By 1997, the Martha Stewart everyday line of bed bath and home furnishing products had become one of the best-selling exclusive brands in American retail. It gave Kmart something it had always struggled to project: taste. Suddenly, buying affordable home goods at Kmart didn't feel like settling. It felt like smart living. The acquisitions followed in rapid succession. Kmart purchased Walden Books in 1984, Builder Square in 1984, Sports Authority in 1990, Office Max in 1991, and Borders Bookstores in 1992. The strategy was aggressive diversification. Build a retail ecosystem so vast that no competitor could match its reach. On the surface, it looked like the moves of a company playing offense. In reality, it was the first sign that Kmart had lost its focus. But in 1994, nobody was talking about that. Because in 1994, Kmart hit its all-time peak. 2,486 stores operating globally, $37 billion in annual revenue, 350,000 employees on the payroll, locations in every major American city, dozens of suburban markets and international outposts stretching from Canada to Singapore to Mexico. The Blue Light Special was an American icon. The Martha Stewart line was selling faster than shelves could be stocked. A Kmart executive looking at the numbers that year had every reason to believe the empire was permanent. There is a particular kind of blindness that comes with being on top. It isn't stupidity. It isn't arrogance, exactly. It's something more insidious. The inability to imagine that the conditions which made you great could ever stop applying. Kmart's leadership in 1994 looked at their stores and saw success. What they didn't see, what they refused to see, was what was happening 800 miles southwest in Bentonville, Arkansas. A company called Walmart had been quietly doing something Kmart never bothered to do: investing in its infrastructure. While Kmart was buying bookstores and sporting goods chains, Walmart was building one of the most sophisticated inventory and supply chain systems in retail history. Satellite technology, real-time data, distribution centers so efficient they could restock a shelf in hours, not days. Kmart's warehouses, by contrast, were aging. Its inventory systems were outdated. Its stores were beginning to show wear that the company's capital expenditure budget wasn't keeping up with. In November 1990, for the first time ever, Walmart's annual sales surpassed Kmart's. The people in Troy, Michigan noted it, discussed it briefly, and moved on. It would prove to be the most expensive mistake in American retail history. The empire was at its peak. The cracks were already there. Sam Walton was not a flashy man. He drove a beat-up pickup truck. He wore a John Deere cap. He ate at the same diner in Bentonville, Arkansas that he'd eaten at for decades. While Kmart executives were flying to New York for meetings and signing celebrity partnerships and acquiring bookstore chains, Walton was doing something far less glamorous and far more dangerous. He was studying. Every week, Walton visited competitor stores. He walked the aisles with a yellow legal pad, writing down prices, noting shelf arrangements, observing how customers moved through the space. He wasn't embarrassed to learn from rivals. He was obsessed with understanding exactly what the customer wanted, and then figuring out how to deliver it cheaper and faster than anyone else. Kmart's leadership occasionally visited their own stores for inspections. Walton visited everyone's stores for intelligence. The difference in philosophy ran deeper than personality. It ran into the operating system of each company. By the late 1980s, Walmart had invested massively in satellite-linked inventory technology, a system that tracked every item sold at every register in real time and automatically triggered restocking orders at distribution centers. It was, for its era, a technological marvel. Suppliers knew exactly what Walmart needed before Walmart's own managers had to ask. Shelves stayed full. Prices stayed low because waste was almost eliminated. The machine ran clean. Kmart's system, meanwhile, was aging badly. Stores placed orders manually. Distribution was fragmented. There was no real-time data linking the register to the warehouse. If a store in suburban Ohio ran out of a fast-moving item on a Wednesday, the shelf might sit empty until the following week's shipment. Customers came in, didn't find what they needed, and left. Some came back, many didn't. This is how retail empires die. Not in dramatic collapses, but in thousands of small, invisible failures. A mother drives to Kmart for school supplies, finds the backpack she wanted or out of stock, and drives to Walmart instead. She finds what she needs. The store is clean. The prices are comparable. She doesn't make a conscious decision to switch loyalties. She just doesn't have a reason to go back to Kmart. Multiply that moment by 10 million customers over 10 years. That's what happened. In November 1990, Walmart's annual revenue surpassed Kmart's for the first time, quietly without fanfare, the way a tide comes in. The gap was narrow that first year, but the trajectory was unmistakable. Walmart was accelerating, Kmart was not, and here is what makes that moment so significant. Kmart still had 4 more years before its peak. The store count kept growing. The revenue numbers still looked impressive. The executives in Troy could, and did, point to the 1994 numbers as proof that everything was fine. But the market share was bleeding. Every year through the early 1990s, Walmart took a little more. Not dramatically. Not in ways that triggered emergency board meetings or radical strategy shifts. Just steadily, methodically, the way water erodes stone. Walmart opened stores in the same towns as Kmart. The Walmart was newer, brighter, more efficiently stocked. Kmart matched Walmart's prices on some items, but not consistently. Customers began to notice that Walmart's shelves were rarely empty. Kmart's frequently were. The question that should have been screaming inside every Kmart boardroom was simple. Why? The answer was in the warehouse, in the satellite uplink, in the distribution center, in the technology gap that Walmart had spent a decade building and Kmart had spent a decade ignoring. Nobody in Troy was asking that question loudly enough. There is a moment in the slow death of any great institution when the people inside it are given a clear choice: adapt or rationalize. Kmart chose to rationalize. The strategic response to Walmart's rise in the early 1990s was not to modernize the supply chain, not to invest in store renovations, not to close the technology gap. Instead, Kmart's leadership doubled down on diversification. More acquisitions, more subsidiaries, more expansion into adjacent markets. The theory was sound on the surface. If Kmart couldn't win on price and efficiency alone, it could win by becoming something Walmart wasn't: a diversified retail ecosystem. The execution was a disaster. By 1994, Kmart was simultaneously trying to manage a 2,186-store discount chain, a bookstore empire through Borders and Walden Books, a sporting goods chain through Sports Authority, an office supply chain through Office Max, and a home improvement chain through Builder Square. Each acquisition had consumed capital that could have gone into upgrading Kmart's actual stores. Each subsidiary required management attention that was pulled away from the core business. And then, almost as suddenly as the buying spree had started, it reversed. Between 1994 and 1995, Kmart sold off Pace Membership Warehouse, Office Max, Sports Authority, and Borders Group. A fire sale of assets that had cost hundreds of millions to acquire. Now being shed at losses the company tried to minimize in press releases and annual reports. The strategy had failed. The capital was gone. And the core Kmart stores, the ones that generated the actual revenue, were now visibly, undeniably deteriorating. Walk into a Kmart in 1996, then walk into a Walmart. The difference was not subtle. Walmart's stores were bright, efficiently organized, consistently stocked. The floors were clean. The signage was clear. The checkout lines moved. Kmart stores, by contrast, had the look of something that hadn't been fully invested in for years. Fluorescent lights flickering, shelving units showing their age, aisles cluttered with half-sorted clearance merchandise. The famous blue light had been discontinued in 1991 as cost-cutting measure. The very symbol of Kmart's personality, switched off to save money. Customers noticed. Not analytically, viscerally. The Walmart felt better. The Kmart felt tired. Meanwhile, Target was executing a different threat entirely. Where Walmart competed on price, Target competed on aspiration, cleaner stores, more fashionable merchandise, a subtle but unmistakable message that shopping there was a cut above the discount experience. Target wasn't just cheaper than department stores, it was nicer than Kmart and Walmart both. Kmart was now trapped in what Harvard Business School would later identify as one of retail's most lethal positions, the undifferentiated middle. Not cheap enough to beat Walmart, not stylish enough to beat Target. No compelling reason to choose Kmart over either competitor. Three cashiers who worked at a Kmart in suburban Columbus, Ohio during this period later recalled the same thing independently. Customers would come in, look around, and ask, almost confused, "Do you have this at a lower price than Walmart?" When the answer was no, they often just left. Not angry, not complaining, just leaving. That quiet exodus, repeated millions of times across thousands of stores, was the sound of an empire losing its reason to exist. Kmart's leadership needed to hear that sound. Instead, in the year 2000, they handed the keys to a man who would turn a slow decline into a catastrophic freefall. His name was Charles Conaway, and he was about to make everything worse. There is a particular kind of corporate failure that doesn't announce itself with scandal or fraud. It arrives quietly, dressed in the language of strategy and vision, signed off in boardrooms by people who genuinely believe they are making the right decision. Kmart's strategic failure of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s was that kind of failure. It began in the early 1970s when Kmart's corporate leadership, flush with success, confident to the point of complacency, established what insiders called the Special Strategy Group. The mandate sounded reasonable. Identify new growth opportunities beyond the core discount retail business. Diversify. Future-proof the company against market shifts. Build something bigger than a chain of blue-sign discount stores. The problem wasn't the intention. The problem was the execution. And more specifically, what the Special Strategy Group took away from the business every time it moved toward something new. Attention is a finite resource. Every hour a senior executive spent evaluating a bookstore acquisition was an hour not spent asking why Kmart's distribution centers were falling behind Walmart's. Every dollar allocated to a new subsidiary was a dollar not spent renovating a store that customers were beginning to find uninviting. The Special Strategy Group didn't just distract Kmart's leadership. It systematically redirected the company's energy away from the one thing that actually mattered, making the core stores better. By the late 1980s, the results were visible on the ground, even if the balance sheet hadn't fully reflected them yet. Kmart stores were aging, the fixtures were dated, the inventory systems were manual and slow. While Walmart was installing satellite-linked technology that could track every item sold in real time, Kmart was managing its supply chain with processes that hadn't fundamentally changed since the 1970s. The acquisitions kept coming anyway. Walden Books in 1984, Builders Square in 1984, Sports Authority in 1990, Office Max in 1991, Borders in 1992. Each purchase was announced with optimism, accompanied by projections of synergy and cross-promotional opportunity. Each one consumed capital that the Kmart stores themselves desperately needed, and each one introduced a layer of operational complexity that Kmart's management structure was not built to handle. CEO Joseph Antonini, who ran the company from 1987 to 1995, embodied this contradiction perfectly. He was not a stupid man. He understood retail. He had risen through Kmart's ranks over decades and genuinely believed in the brand. But Antonini was constitutionally incapable of accepting that the strategy he had inherited and expanded was wrong. Internal voices warning about the supply chain gap, the store quality decline, the growing competitive threat from Walmart. Those voices were heard politely and dismissed quietly. The empire kept expanding. The foundation kept cracking. The internet arrived at the worst possible moment for Kmart. Not because the internet was inherently threatening, every retailer faced the same disruption, but because Kmart's response to it revealed, with painful clarity, that the company had learned nothing from 2 decades of strategic distraction. In 1999, Kmart announced the launch of Bluelight.com, a standalone e-commerce venture developed in partnership with SoftBank Venture Capital and Yahoo. The concept was straightforward. Take the Kmart brand online, compete in the emerging digital retail space, capture the customers who were beginning to shop from their computers. The announcement generated headlines. The investment was substantial. Executives spoke about bluelight.com the way technology companies spoke about their most ambitious ventures, with the confident vocabulary of disruption and transformation. The reality was a fiasco. Bluelight.com burned through capital at a rate that would have been alarming even for a tech startup with no obligations. For a struggling retailer with deteriorating stores and a widening gap against Walmart, it was reckless. The service launched as a free dial-up internet provider, a strategy designed to drive traffic to the website through sheer user volume. It generated users. It did not generate profit. When the free service was restricted in January 2001, and Kmart attempted to convert Blue Light into a paid subscription, the users evaporated. By 2002, with Kmart in bankruptcy, BlueLight.com was sold to United Online, the parent company of NetZero and Juno, for a fraction of what had been invested. The venture that was supposed to carry Kmart into the digital future had instead accelerated its collapse. Meanwhile, the physical stores continued to deteriorate. The Blue Light Special, the single most recognizable symbol of Kmart's identity, had been discontinued in 1991 as a cost-cutting measure, then awkwardly reintroduced in 2001 in a last-ditch attempt to reconnect with customers. The revival landed flat. You cannot manufacture nostalgia on demand. The magic of the original Blue Light was its spontaneity, the unannounced flash, the sudden urgency, the shared excitement of strangers in an aisle. Scheduling it, marketing it, turning it into a promotional event stripped it of everything that had made it work. By the time Floyd Hall retired as chairman and CEO in 2000, Kmart was a company that had spent 30 years telling itself it was fine. 30 years of strategic misfires, deferred maintenance, missed technological investments, and leadership that consistently chose the comfortable narrative over the accurate one. The stores were tired, the brand was confused, the balance sheet was strained, and into this wreckage walked Charles Conaway, a man with no emotional attachment to Kmart's history, no patience for its complexity, and an appetite for personal enrichment that would prove catastrophic. He had 19 months. That was all it took. Charles Conaway arrived at Kmart in May 2000 with a reputation and a price tag. The reputation: he had successfully turned around CVS Corporation, steering the pharmacy chain through a period of aggressive growth and operational improvement. He was sharp, decisive, and, crucially, an outsider. Kmart's board, exhausted by decades of internal leadership that had failed to close the gap with Walmart, wanted someone who would come in without sentimentality and make hard decisions. Conaway seemed to be exactly that person. The price tag, a $5 million personal loan from Kmart itself, a compensation package worth tens of millions over the life of his contract, and the kind of executive authority that left very little room for dissent below him. The board signed the check. Conaway walked into the corner office on the top floor of Kmart's Troy, Michigan headquarters. And almost immediately, the people who worked directly beneath him began to understand that something was deeply wrong. Conaway's management style was not the decisive, data-driven leadership the board had expected. It was something closer to autocracy built on intimidation. Executives who raised concerns about the company's financial position, who brought honest assessments of the supply chain problems, the vendor payment backlogs, the accelerating loss of market share, were not thanked for their candor. They were marginalized, transferred, quietly pushed out. The Detroit News would later describe his tenure in terms that left little room for interpretation. A 2-year program of deceit, intimidation, and unauthorized spending. What Conaway had understood the moment he sat down in that corner office, and what he chose to conceal from everyone outside it, was that Kmart was in far worse shape than the public knew. The vendor relationships were strained to the point of breaking. Kmart owed money to suppliers it hadn't paid on time. Its revolving credit lines were being drawn down faster than they were being replenished. The inventory system was so outdated that the company genuinely didn't have reliable data on what was selling and what was sitting. The stores were losing customers not in dramatic defections, but in the slow, grinding way that a tire loses air. imperceptibly at first, and then suddenly flat. A CEO who understood his fiduciary responsibility had two options: disclose the situation to shareholders and develop a credible turnaround plan, or raise capital by being transparent about the risks. Conaway chose a third option. He told investors everything was fine. In earnings calls and public statements throughout 2000 and 2001, Conaway projected confidence. Kmart was executing its strategy. The turnaround was on track. The competitive pressures were manageable. There was no indication, none publicly, that the company was approaching a liquidity crisis. Shareholders held their positions. Creditors maintained their terms. Vendors kept shipping for a while because nothing in the official narrative suggested they should do otherwise. Meanwhile, in the executive suites and on the corporate aircraft, a different story was being written. Conaway and his president, Mark Schwartz, were later accused of using company funds in ways that had nothing to do with saving Kmart. Private aircraft usage beyond any reasonable business justification. Real estate, personal expenditures processed through corporate accounts. The specifics, when they eventually emerged in SEC filings and court documents, read less like the behavior of executives trying to rescue a struggling company and more like men who had decided, consciously or not, that the ship was going down, and they intended to be comfortable while it did. The people beneath them in the organization knew pieces of the truth. Some knew large pieces. A regional manager in the Midwest who tracked vendor shipments noticed in late 2000 that certain suppliers were beginning to delay deliveries, not canceling, not making demands, but hesitating in the way that creditors hesitate when they aren't sure they'll be paid. She flagged it internally. The flag disappeared into the bureaucracy without response. A financial analyst at headquarters who ran projections on Kmart's liquidity position in early 2001 produced a report that, had it been shared with the board in unredacted form, would have triggered immediate action. The report was modified before it reached the board. The analyst was reassigned 3 weeks later. The machine was failing. The people who knew it were being silenced. And the blue light, reintroduced that same year in a desperate attempt to revive the brand, was flashing in empty aisles. By the fall of 2001, the walls were closing in. Kmart's cash position had deteriorated to the point where the company was actively struggling to pay its suppliers on schedule. The holiday season, the single most important retail period of the year, the stretch that could make or break an entire fiscal year, was approaching. And the vendors who supplied Kmart's shelves with the toys, electronics, clothing, and housewares that holiday shoppers expected to find were beginning to make calls. Not angry calls, not ultimatums, just quiet, careful questions from accounts receivable departments at major suppliers. When can we expect payment on the outstanding balance? Kmart didn't have good answers. In November 2001, Kmart reintroduced the Blue Light Special with a splashy marketing campaign, partnering with celebrities and running national television advertisements. The message was nostalgic and optimistic. Kmart was back, the iconic experience was returning, the best days were ahead. Jacqueline Smith, Martha Stewart, and Kathy Ireland stood under blue lights for promotional photographs. Behind the scenes, the company was 4 to 6 weeks away from being unable to meet its financial obligations. By December, the largest suppliers had stopped waiting for answers and started making decisions. Fleming Companies, Kmart's primary food and consumables distributor, under a $4.5 billion contract, began restricting shipments. Other major vendors followed. Not publicly. There were no press releases, no dramatic announcements, just a quiet tightening of the supply line, the way a river narrows before it runs dry. Shelves in Kmart stores across the country began showing gaps. Not every aisle, not catastrophically, not yet, but enough that store managers were fielding questions from customers and sending urgent messages up the chain. The messages went unanswered. On January 22, 2002, Charles Conaway called an all-hands meeting at Kmart headquarters in Troy, Michigan. The room was full. Employees who had worked at Kmart for 10, 15, 20 years sat in rows, some of them having driven in before dawn, uncertain what the meeting was about, but sensing, the way people sense these things, that it was serious. The building felt different that morning, quieter in the wrong way. People spoke in the hushed tones of a waiting room. Conaway walked to the front of the room. He told them Kmart was filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, effective immediately, the largest retail bankruptcy filing in American history at that time. $17 billion in assets, $11 billion in liabilities, 215 stores, and 250,000 employees suddenly uncertain about their futures. He said he accepted full blame. In a federal courthouse in Chicago that same morning, Kmart's lawyers filed the paperwork. Outside the Troy headquarters, television news trucks were already arriving. Across the country in Kmart stores from Florida to Oregon, employees opened the doors at their regular time, switched on the lights, and went to work. Because nobody had told them not to. Customers walked in, registers rang. The blue light stood silent in its aisle. The empire was filing for bankruptcy, and the stores were still open because the machine was too big to stop all at once. What followed in the coming weeks stripped away whatever remained of Conaway's credibility. The SEC began examining the statements he had made to investors in the months preceding the bankruptcy. The confident earnings calls, the optimistic projections, the carefully worded assurances that everything was under control. What investigators found was a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation. In 2009, Conaway was charged by a jury with misleading investors. A fraud case the Detroit News compared, in scope and character, to the Enron scandal that had consumed the business world just months earlier. He was ordered to repay the $5 million loan Kmart had given him to take the job. The 250,000 employees who had sat in that room, or opened those stores, or stocked those shelves, they were not repaid anything. Kmart closed 326 stores in January 2003, laying off approximately 34,000 workers in the process. Some had worked there for decades. Some were within years of a pension they would now never fully collect. They walked out of those stores for the last time, carrying the same things they had walked in with. Their uniforms, their name tags, their years. The blue light did not flash for them on their way out. While Charles Conaway was standing in front of Kmart's employees accepting blame, a man in Greenwich, Connecticut was already doing math. His name was Edward Lampert. He was 39 years old, ran a hedge fund called ESL Investments, and had built a reputation on Wall Street as one of the sharpest, distressed asset investors of his generation. Lampert didn't see Kmart the way Kmart's customers saw it, as a store, a brand, a place with memories attached. He saw it the way a mathematician sees an equation, a collection of assets, liabilities, and variables that, properly rearranged, could produce an extraordinary return. The asset he was most interested in wasn't the merchandise. It wasn't the brand. It wasn't the Blue Light Special or the Martha Stewart line or the decades of customer loyalty. It was the real estate. Kmart owned or held long-term leases on over 2,000 properties across the United States. Prime retail locations, corner lots, high-traffic suburban corridors, anchor positions in shopping centers, accumulated over 40 years of aggressive expansion. In a bankruptcy proceeding, those leases could be renegotiated, sold, or monetized in ways that had nothing to do with selling discount merchandise. To a real estate-minded investor, Kmart's bankruptcy wasn't a catastrophe. It was an opportunity. Beginning in 2002, while Kmart was navigating Chapter 11 proceedings, ESL Investments began quietly purchasing Kmart's distressed debt at heavily discounted prices. Bankruptcy debt trades at a fraction of face value. The market assumes the creditor will recover pennies on the dollar. Lampert was betting he could recover far more. He accumulated a dominant position in Kmart's unsecured notes, which gave him extraordinary leverage in the reorganization process. By the time Kmart emerged from bankruptcy in May 2003, Lampert had effectively engineered the outcome. ESL Investments controlled 53% of the reorganized company, a majority stake acquired for an investment of less than $1 billion. On exchange, $7.8 billion in debt had been wiped from Kmart's balance sheet. The company relisted on NASDAQ in June 2003 under the ticker symbol KMRT, with Lampert installed as chairman of the new board of directors. On paper, it looked like a rescue. Lampert told the press that Kmart's future lay not in chasing Walmart on price, but in running a leaner, more profitable operation. He was dismissive of the retail industry's fixation on top-line sales growth. The focus that a lot of people have in retail revolves around sales, and he said, but sales without profit do not allow a business to be successful. It was a quote that sounded reasonable in isolation. In context, applied to a retail chain that needed investment, renovation, and competitive repositioning, it was a signal of exactly what Lampert intended to do, which was, as little as possible, the capital that a genuine turnaround required: store renovations, technology upgrades, supply chain modernization, the basic infrastructure investments that Kmart had deferred for 2 decades, was not forthcoming. Instead, Lampert focused on closing unprofitable stores and selling the real estate beneath them. Between 2003 and 2005, hundreds of Kmart locations were shuttered, their properties monetized. The store count shrank. The revenue shrank with it. But the cash generated from asset sales flowed upward to ESL, to the shareholders Lampert cared about most. The employees who remained watched their stores continue to deteriorate. The customers who came back after the bankruptcy found largely the same experience that had driven them away in the first place. Just with fewer locations to choose from, Lampert had not saved Kmart. He had stabilized it long enough to extract value from it, and he wasn't finished yet. In November 2004, Edward Lampert made a move that stunned the retail industry. Kmart, a company that had emerged from the largest retail bankruptcy in American history just 18 months earlier, announced it would acquire Sears, Roebuck and Company for approximately $11 billion. Sears, the iconic department store chain that had defined American retail for over a century, would be absorbed by the discount retailer it had once dwarfed. The logic, as Lampert presented it, was synergy. Two struggling retailers combined into one entity, Sears Holdings Corporation, could cut costs, share infrastructure, leverage combined purchasing power, and present a unified competitive front against Walmart and Target. The deal closed in March 2005. Lampert controlled nearly 40% of the new corporation. The retail industry was skeptical from day one. Analysts pointed out that combining two companies with overlapping problems didn't solve either company's problems. It just made the problems larger. Sears and Kmart served different customer bases, occupied different retail formats, and had different brand identities. The synergies were largely theoretical. What was concrete was the combined real estate portfolio. Thousands of properties that, in Lampert's hands, could be monetized through a real estate investment trust structure he was already developing. The years that followed confirmed the skeptics. Sears Holdings did not invest meaningfully in either the Kmart or Sears store formats. Capital expenditure per store remained far below industry benchmarks. The stores continued to age. The merchandise assortment fell behind competitors. Customer traffic declined year after year with the reliability of a calendar. Lampert, running the company with an unusual degree of personal control, restructured Sears Holdings internally into competing business units. An organizational philosophy inspired by Ayn Rand's theories of rational self-interest that applied to a retail operation produced internal competition and dysfunction where collaboration was desperately needed. Employees and former executives who spoke to journalists during this period described an atmosphere of paralysis. Decisions that required cross-departmental cooperation, basic retail decisions about inventory, marketing, store layout, were delayed or blocked by the unit structure. Managers who had spent careers in retail watched strategies they knew to be failing continue unchallenged because no one with authority over multiple units was focused on the actual shopping experience. The numbers told the story without ambiguity. Kmart's revenue in fiscal 2004, $31 billion. By 2018, $5.8 billion, a decline of 81% in 14 years. The U.S. store count fell from over 1,500 locations to fewer than 750. The Martha Stewart partnership, once the crown jewel of Kmart's brand strategy, ended acrimoniously in 2010 after Stewart publicly complained that Kmart had allowed her line to deteriorate. The blue light special was reintroduced and retired and reintroduced again, each revival more desperate than the last, a brand trying to remember who it used to be. On October 15, 2018, Sears Holdings Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the second time. Kmart went down with it. Lampert, serving simultaneously as Sears Holdings chairman and CEO, proposed acquiring the company out of bankruptcy for $4.6 billion through ESL investments, effectively buying the same assets he had already owned at a discount for the second time. The bankruptcy court approved a modified version of the deal in 2019. A new entity called Transform SR Brands LLC acquired the remaining assets. The retail operation that emerged was a ghost of a ghost. A man who had entered Kmart's story as a potential savior had presided over the longest, most methodical destruction of a retail brand in American history. Whether that outcome was the result of failed strategy, deliberate extraction, or simple incompetence remains debated. What is not debated is the result. By 2024, the last full-size Kmart on the American mainland closed its doors. Lampert filed his final appeal with the U.S. Supreme Court shortly after. The court declined to hear it. The bankruptcy filing was a number on a court document. The store closures were a statistic in a press release. But on the morning of January 13, 2003, when Kmart announced it would permanently close 326 stores across the United States, the number that mattered most wasn't on any balance sheet. It was $34,000. The number of human beings who drove to work that day not knowing it would be one of their last shifts. They were cashiers and stock clerks and department managers and loss prevention officers and deli counter workers and automotive service technicians. They were people who had built their lives around a schedule, a paycheck, and in many cases a sense of identity that came from showing up to the same place, serving the same community for years, sometimes decades. Kmart had not been a glamorous employer. The wages were modest, the benefits modest, the career ceiling visible from the first week. But it had been reliable. For working-class Americans in the towns where Kmart was often the largest employer within driving distance, reliable was everything. Consider what a Kmart store actually meant to a small American town in 2002. It wasn't just a place to buy dish soap and school supplies. It was frequently the economic anchor of its immediate neighborhood. The tenant that kept a strip mall viable, the employer that provided entry-level jobs with enough hours to matter, the affordable option that allowed families living paycheck to paycheck to stretch their dollars through the month. When the Kmart closed, the ripple effect moved outward in concentric circles. The strip mall lost its anchor tenant. Neighboring small businesses, the nail salon, the sub shop, the cell phone kiosk, lost the foot traffic that had kept them alive. Property values softened. Tax revenues dipped. The visible gap in the commercial landscape sent a signal about the health of the community that was difficult to reverse. Retail historians call these closures anchor exits. Economists document their downstream effects in studies, but the studies don't capture what it looked like on the ground. The hand-lettered signs in the window announcing the going out of business sale, the gradual emptying of shelves that had been stocked for 40 years, the last day when the remaining employees gathered in the parking lot and someone took a photograph because it felt like something that should be documented, even if nobody had asked them to. 3 people, 3 outcomes, all real. A woman in Dayton, Ohio had worked the Kmart pharmacy counter for 19 years. She was 51 years old when the store closed. She had 2 years left before the pension she had been promised would have fully vested. The bankruptcy reorganization restructured the pension obligations. What she ultimately received was a fraction of what she had been counting on. She spent the following 3 years working part-time at a drugstore chain for lower wages, while her husband managed the mortgage on income that no longer made sense for it. A 24-year-old stock clerk in rural Georgia had been at Kmart for 14 months when the closure was announced. He was young enough to absorb the loss without long-term damage, found a position at a nearby Walmart within 6 weeks, earning slightly less per hour. He didn't have strong feelings about the brand either way. To him, Kmart had been a job. Walmart was a job. The store was just the store. A store manager in suburban Michigan had spent 23 years working his way up from part-time cashier to managing a location with 180 employees. He knew every department, every supplier relationship, every quirk of the building. When his store closed, he was offered a position at a surviving Kmart location 40 miles away at a reduced salary. He declined. He spent the next year consulting, then opened a small hardware store that closed after 2 years. He retired earlier than he had planned, on less than he had saved for. Three people, three outcomes, one common thread. Nobody from the corner office called to check on them. The blue light had been their light too. They turned it off without asking. American law moves slowly. By the time the legal system caught up with what had happened inside Kmart's corner office, the company had already emerged from bankruptcy, relisted on the stock market, merged with Sears, and begun its second slow decline. The people who had lost their jobs were years into rebuilding their lives. The stores that had closed were already being converted into churches, self-storage facilities, and discount furniture warehouses. The architectural afterlife of failed retail anchors. But in 2009, 7 years after the bankruptcy filing, the reckoning arrived. The Securities and Exchange Commission announced that a jury had found Charles Conaway guilty of misleading investors about Kmart's financial condition in the months preceding the January 2002 bankruptcy. The charges were specific and documented. Conaway had made materially false statements in public filings and earnings calls, painting a picture of operational stability for shareholders while internally managing a company he knew was approaching collapse. He had withheld information that, had it been disclosed, would have allowed investors to make informed decisions about their positions. The SEC's findings confirmed what Kmart's own employees had suspected for years, that the confident public narrative and the panicked private reality had been two entirely different stories running simultaneously, and that the gap between them had been maintained deliberately. Conaway was ordered to repay the $5 million personal loan Kmart had extended to him upon his hiring. He did not face criminal imprisonment. He was not barred from future executive positions permanently. The penalties measured against the scale of the damage, 250,000 employees, 326 closed stores, $17 billion in assets swallowed by a bankruptcy proceeding, struck many observers as profoundly inadequate. Mark Schwartz, Kmart's president during the same period, faced parallel proceedings. The pattern of behavior documented across both executives drew repeated comparisons to the Enron scandal, a corporate fraud case that had defined the early 2000s and led to sweeping legislative reform through the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The Kmart case never achieved the same cultural visibility as Enron, perhaps because Kmart's collapse was slower and less dramatic, perhaps because the victims were cashiers and stock clerks rather than pension-holding middle managers whose losses generated sustained media outrage. Edward Lampert's legal story continued well past the Sears Holdings bankruptcy of 2018. After the bankruptcy court approved his acquisition of the remaining assets through Transform SR Brands, Lampert filed multiple appeals arguing that the collateral valuations used in the proceedings had shortchanged him, that he had been underpaid for assets he believed were worth more than the court had determined. He pursued those appeals through the federal system with the same methodical persistence he had applied to accumulating Kmart's distressed debt 16 years earlier. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear his final appeal. The ruling was announced in a brief order without comment. For the 34,000 workers who lost their jobs in January 2003, for the woman in Dayton who missed her pension by 2 years, for the manager in Michigan who retired on less than he had planned, there were no appeals. No filings, no legal mechanisms through which they could recover what they had lost. The bankruptcy process had treated their claims as unsecured obligations, subordinate to the financial instruments held by institutional creditors and hedge funds. They had built the stores. They had stocked the shelves. They had switched on the blue lights every morning for decades. The law had a process for the investor who felt underpaid. It had no equivalent process for them. In 2024, the last full-size Kmart store on the American mainland closed its doors. There was no press conference, no commemorative event, no executive statement reflecting on 125 years of history. A manager locked the front entrance, the automatic doors went still, and the parking lot, once the kind of place where station wagons and minivans circled for spots on a Saturday afternoon, sat empty under fluorescent sky. Inside, the shelves were bare. The lunch counter was long gone. The intercom was silent. Attention, Kmart shoppers. Nobody left to hear it. What died in that parking lot was not simply a retail chain. It was something more specific and more instructive. a case study in how every layer of institutional failure can operate simultaneously without anyone in a position of authority being willing to name what they are watching. The executives of the 1970s and 80s were not villains. They were distracted by acquisitions that looked like strategy and turned out to be avoidance, by the comfort of good numbers that masked deteriorating fundamentals, by the deeply human tendency to believe that what worked yesterday will work tomorrow if you simply do more of it. They had a great company. They stopped asking what made it great. The executives of the 1990s were not stupid. They were trapped between a Walmart that had outinvested them technologically by a decade and a Target that had outpositioned them aesthetically by design. They had waited too long to modernize and too long to differentiate, and by the time the urgency was undeniable, the capital required to respond had already been spent on subsidiaries they would soon be selling at a loss. Charles Conaway was something else entirely. Not distracted, not trapped. Deliberately dishonest. A man who understood exactly what was happening and chose personal enrichment over the people who had trusted him with their company and their careers. His fraud did not cause Kmart's decline. The decline was already well underway when he arrived. What his fraud did was eliminate the last window in which a genuine turnaround might have been possible. Every month he spent concealing the truth was a month in which a different leader, an honest one, might have been making different decisions. And Edward Lampert, the man who came with a calculator where a vision should have been, who looked at a struggling retailer and saw a real estate portfolio, who ran a company built on human beings, on store managers and cashiers and regional directors and deli counter workers, as though it were a financial instrument to be optimized rather than an institution to be led. The stores rotted on his watch not because retail is impossible, but because he chose not to invest in them. The math told him not to. The math was right about the returns. The math said nothing about the towns. 3 lessons, not new ones, not lessons the business world hasn't heard before, but lessons that Kmart paid for with 125 years of history and 350,000 jobs and thousands of communities that lost their anchor and never fully recovered. Know what you are. Kmart lost its identity trying to be everything: bookstore owner, sporting goods retailer, internet company, lifestyle brand, and ended up being nothing clearly enough to survive. Leadership is a moral act. The people in the building trusted the person at the top with their futures. That trust is not a resource to be managed. It is an obligation. A company is not its assets. The real estate was valuable. The debt was tradable. The brand was monetizable. None of those things were Kmart. Kmart was the cashier who had worked the same register for 19 years. The manager who knew every supplier by name. The kid who got his first job there at 16 and learned what it meant to show up. When you strip those people out in pursuit of the number, you don't have a leaner company. You have an empty building. The blue light flashed for the last time in 2024. For 60 years, it had meant something good was about to happen. Something affordable. Something unexpected. Something shared between strangers in an aisle who all looked up at the same moment toward the same light. Attention, Kmart shoppers. The store is closed. The light is off. But the lesson, if anyone is paying attention, is still on.